Coming up as the Brooklyn Nets continue to head towards training camp later this offseason and ultimately the year ahead, some forgotten members of recent trades like Bojan Bogdanovic. Does he have a role for the Nets? Is he the veteran on the bench that we've been waiting for? We talk about his points, the stats, the injuries, and what it looks like for Brooklyn, all coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. He's Doug Norrie. I'm Adam Marbeck. We thank you, as always, for making us your first listen of the day. We're 100% free on all those great platforms. And let you know, today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms, they do apply. And Doug, some terms apply when you're covering the Brooklyn Nets and they're making a lot of moves and they're shedding a lot of contracts and they're getting all these picks. Yeah, you got to kind of cover some of these other players that maybe, just maybe, have faded into the background over the course of this offseason.
Yeah, look, I mean, maybe like our bad, maybe just the way it's been reported, maybe just like the way that things kind of just ended up shaking out with the Mikal Bridges trade. But Bojan Bogdanovic does come over in the trade, and good on YouTube commenter. Just should let you know we do read all the YouTube comments. YouTube commenter Ray J90 who just says, I think you guys seem to have forgotten about Bojan Bogdanovic, and I think there was like part of that might. Well, we didn't. We didn't. We knew he was. We know he's there, but we just sort of. It has been a little out of sight, out of mind that he came over in this trade. There's been very little spoken about, like sort of him. We'll get to some of the reasons why. Even the guys who were the wings that could probably like see minutes, like they're up in trade talks, or they're a lot younger guys that people are a lot more excited about. So I think there's like a lot of reasons to not really bring up Bojan. But like at this point, with not really many moves being made and the roster seemingly getting sort of set here going in, like into the sort of the deeper part of the offseason, it is worth bringing up sort of like what the possibility that he has a role, if any, on this team, like what he could possibly bring. Is there trade value to him at all? It would seem from the talks that there's not. Yeah. But for a guy, and bad on me, because like even yesterday when we're talking about guys who came back over, I would specifically say Shake Milton and then just ignore the guy who made the money match, right? like Bojan was the reason that the money ended up matching in the thing. And we'll get to some of the reasons why he's forgotten too. It has a little to do with like the end of his Knicks time. But yeah, in general, basically since the trade, we haven't really talked about him at all. And yeah, time to correct some of those mistakes.
I think there was an announcement about him wearing the same number maybe that he wore when he was first drafted by the Brooklyn Nets all those years ago. So there's been some chatter out there in the media for Bogdanovic. But to your point, I think because of we need not justify it, but because of the way the Nets are going here, it's a rebuild. We're going young. We have this core. Okay. Then we're talking about the players with value, obviously Johnson and Dorian Finney-Smith, who, by the way, I think the reason why, not only because they've been on this roster, but because they also represent one, fan base frustration, if you're talking about Cam Johnson, because didn't live up to the billing when he came over, and expectations, whether or not they were unreasonably set. And then Dorian Finney-Smith, who the fan base and many collectively agree should have been traded once, twice, three times over the past year and a half, 2 seasons, right? So there's a ire that goes towards those players that have been on this team. In Bogdanovic's case, 35 years old, right? Like veteran player. You mentioned salary match, expiring contract. And I almost feel like, and we've talked about Dennis Schroeder before too, but it almost falls into that kind of category for me where it's, yeah, thanks for the money. We needed that to get this deal done. I don't know if you have a value or if you have a trade value or if you have a team value. So the reasons to look over a player like him and over Shake Milton, we mentioned him by name, but it's not like we're deep diving into his value for this roster in the upcoming season, is so predicated on what this team is, what the agenda is going forward. And I think take the name away, just see the age, I think. Yeah. And anybody over the age of 25, you go, I mean, do we even need to worry about this guy being an integral part of the rebuild in Brooklyn? No, but it doesn't mean that he can't have value for this organization. Contract, trade, role, minutes filling, all those kind of things can still be a factor here for him.
Yeah, look, he's entering his age 36 season. He's coming off 2 injuries in the offseason, a foot injury where he underwent season-ending wrist and foot surgery. And by the way, classic like getting old. This is like the getting old headline that I feel about every day. It's like, what hurts today? It's like, well, my wrist hurts, my ankle hurts, my back hurt. It kind of all hurts. So maybe we could have surgery on everything. Like,
It's bad when you go in. I went in for the foot surgery and they said, you know what? This wrist looks a little concerning.
You know, hit the wrist too. Hit the wrist too while we're here. If you're gonna put me out,
you already got out all the knives and everything. If you already put on the mask and the hat,
if you already got all the tools out, and we're already just laying in the bed, and you're gonna hit the foot anyway, just head back up to the wrist and let's just get that done too. So, so he does leave, and it's funny too because his Knicks time, he comes over at the deadline for the Knicks, and actually seemed like he was going to be a contributor for New York. And in some ways, I mean, he did get some playing time. Obviously, the minutes drastically reduced. He was not going to be in the starting lineup for this team. Felt like he could be like, some secondary scoring punch off the bench. He was averaging over 20 points a game for Detroit. And there was a combination of just like, it wasn't like there was some injury, but he was also getting Tibbs out of this rotation also before that. Like it was just locked in his guys, and it didn't seem like Bojan was going to be one of those guys. And so even like sort of as things are going, the minutes just aren't trending in the right direction, and he's just not really finding his place. Now, if you want to say that's a Tibbs problem, not a Bogey problem, I can probably hear that because we have lots of examples of guys just, Alec Burks had same thing happened to Alec Burks. And then he came for some, playoff minutes and was like, this guy's might be the second best Knick, and then he kind of just disappeared, and then he got hurt and he disappears again too. So sometimes it's a little hard to tell if you're just if you're having sort of on-court issues or just it's a Tibbs issue because he's just as a sort of singular kind of coach. It doesn't help that the surgeries in the offseason, and we haven't heard much from him since then. Yeah. So it's like a little bit confusing about maybe what the plan is here. But, you don't have to look too far back, at least to say like he was playing meaningful minutes in Detroit and scoring and shooting well. The team sucked, obviously, and they were way worse with him on the court than off, like by them like 6 points in net rating or something like that. But I don't know, veteran, former net. I mean, there's stories you can tell about where it's not a total zero coming in here.
Boy, meaningful minutes in the Detroit Pistons. Two phrases that usually don't go in a sentence together, but it is interesting.
He started games.
Yes, tongue in cheek, taking shots at another team that's going to be in the tank right alongside the Brooklyn Nets. No, I agree with you. And coming up here in a second, why maybe having a player like Bogdanovic, a veteran forward on this roster, can make other decisions easier for the front office when it comes to Cam Johnson, Dorian Finney-Smith, and the rest. We'll break down if this broken down player can have a role in Brooklyn, coming up here in just one moment.
All right, before we get to that, tell you about our friends over at Game Time. Look, it's the summertime. You want to get in on some of that MLB action. It's rolling all through the summer over on Game Time. And they got everything else too, concerts, comedy, theater. It's all there for you. But if you want to get in some baseball action over here at Game Time, they got plenty for you. If you want to get into the Mets stuff, I mean, they have Braves at Mets starting at $11. If you get into it early here on Thursday, you're probably gonna have to kind of hurry to get over there. But it's $27 over the weekend, $18 on Saturday. You're not gonna find better deals than our friends over at Game Time. Game Time takes all the issues out of getting tickets. You can see exactly what you're going to see when you sit down. You're going to get all in pricing, get flash deals, you can get zone deals. Like you're going to be able to see exactly what you're going to see from your seat when you get there, all in pricing, get the lowest price guarantee as well. Game Time has you covered across the board when it comes to getting tickets. You can take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed.
All right, so as we continue today's Locked On Nets episode, talking not only about Bojan Bogdanovic and coming over in the trade that helped balance the books here for Mikal Bridges, but also I think we'll get into a little bit of Shake Milton here and just these veteran players, right? Guys that are a little bit older, have had roles, have had somewhat different careers in terms of their value to their rosters, and whether or not it positions Brooklyn to be successful to move on from some other veterans as well. My curiosity is the injury part for Bogdanovic and whether or not this is just simply like, hey, this guy, who knows, right? The unknown about the injuries and where he's going to be. And the fan base will love this. Talk to me in the YouTube comments. The like Joe Harris kind of end of tenure vibes, just injuries, trying to come back. You're paying him more than you want to. Now there'll be no ire around Bogdanovic because it's not like the Nets gave out this contract, but it has all of that like aging, one-dimensional value kind of player that'll be on the Nets bench here in the upcoming season. And you have to just kind of look past that and think about what it'll be after you move on from him, and a little bit of ties there with Joe Harris in Detroit as well.
Yeah, I mean, and look, I mean, Bogey was like a better overall player than
Oh,
Joe
of
Harris
course.
is.
Yeah.
I don't think you're making that just a real quick squash the comparisons. I don't think you're saying that. I think you're talking about like the end of time is that when you start having surgeries and when you're 35 years old, take it from someone who's like broke a bone early in his life and then broke a bone later in his life,
Same thing.
and
Did it feel the same?
the stories are written very differently about how those two things played out. Not comparing myself to a professional athlete, but anyone who knows, as you get older, it's just harder to heal. It's like it's a double-edged sword. It's like harder to heal just because your body's older. It's got a million miles on it. He's played a lot of NBA minutes.
He played
And
3 seasons. Sorry, he played 3 seasons in Turkey professionally before he came over to the NBA. So I mean, like the dude, like he came over NBA in 24. He's been in the league for over a decade now, but also played 3 years professionally. He has 719 NBA games on his ledger. Like he's played, and he's played quality minutes for a lot of teams.
totally at like high-end playoff minutes for the
Yes.
Jazz, right? Like
Yes.
this guy was a real guy here. But when you get to this age and you're coming off multiple surgeries, besides just the recovery time, the double bottom line of just like, and I'm not blaming this should be anybody, like just like the sheer motivation and energy around rehabbing too diminishes. That would be with anybody. Right.
Yeah.
Like, so, and maybe he's an outlier, right? Maybe that could be the case, but it's just like none of the age curve stuff, none of what we know just about professional athletes in general by having a sample size of, all of them, except for like maybe LeBron, like the everyone else, it's just harder and harder to recover over time. So I think the idea that he comes in and just has like meaningful swing minutes for the Nets is very unlikely. I think it's probably unlikely like he finishes out the year as a net, just based on the contract and it's expiring, and like maybe you want to just match something in another deal because you're trying to get money off the books from somewhere else. I mean, the part where he comes in as a veteran who's just has like those 700 plus games in him, and you just want to like just sort of shape how a professional is, and things that you can take away for a young roster, he would strike me as like one of the perfect guys to have on this
Yeah.
team, right? It's like he's more than just a shooter. He was a real NBA scorer, right? Like he has a long professional career. I mean, when teams go into the tank, it's one thing to say, hey, like, don't make sure that there's no veterans blocking development. I always think that's a little overstated. I think fans get like too hand wringy about that potential problem. I don't think it's really that much of a problem. And two, it is just good to have guys like on the team that have been through sort of all stages of where a team can be along the timeline. Like this guy's been basically except right up to like the championship level. He hasn't been there, but he's been everywhere else on the timeline and just being like, hey, this is how professionals roll. I've been on the worst teams and I've been on some really, really good teams. And this is just how you go about your business. So I think like guys like this are kind of perfect to have. And I just am mostly curious about like sort of like what happens when they break camp more than anything else, because it has been kind of a lot of radio silence on like what the deal is with him.
Yeah, and if we went down the road of saying that he's healthy, let's say the foot and the wrist and the arm and the brain and the ear and the eye and the everything else is now bionic and he's ready to go for the upcoming season. If you assume that he's healthy, then if you want to go the route of, hey, you watch Summer League and Jalen Wilson looks electric and he's winning the MVP, right? Noah Clowney's going to come into his own. I think it's easier to paint a favorable picture for all the young players if a Cameron Johnson trade comes to pass and now it's just Bogdanovic. He's a veteran in that forward room offering. You mentioned, hey, this is how you go about it. I've been around for a decade. I know some of the highs and lows, and I can help you kind of develop along the way. And I also don't get in the way of you maybe taking on a larger role. As you grow into it, I can go ahead and step aside somewhat comfortably. And a big difference to me would be, like, let's paint the picture that Bogdanovic is healthy and he starts at the 3. But we all want Jalen Wilson because now we've traded Cam Johnson. There is a difference to go into the season and have Cam Johnson be the starter in terms of his trade value and accomplishing something with him potentially. If you have him there and then you slowly, gracefully ease him out of a starting rotation role and Jalen Wilson in. That can hurt you. Hey, whether or not you're a tanking team, other teams around the league are going to look and say, so what are we talking about? Cam Johnson lost his starting role to Jalen Wilson. Where is the value for this player? We talked about this a lot with Dorian Finney-Smith. It's a lot easier to be Bogdanovic, veteran player. He's here. Once Jalen Wilson's ready to take it, you go ahead and step aside, and there's no issue. There's no loss of value for the organization in terms of trades that they might make if it comes to whether now or at the deadline during the season.
Yeah, because I don't think anyone's telling themselves like any like false narrative or false hope around like where he is in his like timeline here, right?
Exactly.
Like I don't I think that like the writing's pretty much on the wall, I would say, for how this is going to go. And again, too, like we are at a place too where we just have to say we haven't heard much. Like we know he had these surgeries. This is one of the reasons we haven't talked about it is because no one else seems to really talk about him coming over, right?
Yes.
Like he doesn't get mentioned in trade stuff. He doesn't get mentioned in like really in sort of rotational stuff. He doesn't get mentioned really at all. And if we're looking at like any part of the problem of like trying to evaluate sort of like what the role is, the money I might not even be guaranteed fully this year. Let me just double check that. There's a world where this isn't even like totally 100% guaranteed money, and so yeah, it's not fully guaranteed. So like again, when I say that there's a chance that he doesn't finish out the season as a net, I mean, is there a chance he doesn't even start the season a net? I don't think that's probably on the table, but I would probably put it at a non-zero chance only because of sort of like, no news is no news.
Yeah.
And it's not like we can just make assumptions about a guy who wasn't here, who again is coming off 2 injuries to parts of your body that are fairly important when you want to play basketball, your hands and your feet. Right. So like there is just reason to sort of head scratch around a little bit about maybe it was just money matching and that's it.
Yeah, and I think when we look also at a guy like Shake Milton and what that's going to mean in the short term, and you lump all these guys together, a big difference here we'll talk about coming up in a second is where the cap is currently for Brooklyn. If this was a year from now, an off season from now, well, then you could kind of lock in a lot of players at a lot of different figures to make sure they get to that salary floor. Instead, there is some flexibility here. We'll discuss how much the veteran lineup could shift for Brooklyn here over the remainder of the summer. Getting to that to close out today's show in just one moment. And as we wrap up today's Locked On Nets episode, we let you know that if you're watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day and you're having to turn down the volume with all of that shouting that goes on, why don't you make the switch over to Locked On Sports today? It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings the can't miss analysis, opinions, news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or on the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. And it's your team and it's every day. The last thing I think here is just about how much do we think this will shift? Because there's a part of me that when we say, oh, Bogdanovic, kind of forgotten man here. Shake Milton. I mean, we've mentioned his name as being a part of the trade, but it's not like we're getting into real discussions about where they line up here. The Nets' current roster is filled, barring the two more two-way contracts that they can give out. They do have the 15-man roster. But if you go in and you look at it, where would where the Nets want to make their adjustments? How do they want to shift these things? Where is the even short-term, I'm not going to say confidence, expectation level in terms of what Ben Simmons is going to be entering the season? All these things kind of matter here. And when you look into that backcourt, I find it interesting to see how much more movement we get from the Brooklyn Nets, right? Zaire Williams gets brought in here via trade, an extra pick. Are the Nets going to try to get 2 or 3 more younger guys here and go into the season saying we shed even more money, Bogdanovic being a big part of that at $19 million, and we're just going to kind of throw the balls out there with a lot of young guys and let the minutes get figured out on their own? Because that's the one difference. If it's a healthy Bogdanovic, Cam Johnson, Dorian Finney-Smith, all these guys, you do get the safety net of saying, all right, I know I can give 20 minutes here, 20 minutes there. I know that I have guys that can log those minutes, and fans don't want to hear this all the time, but like you do have to fill it. You do have to fill up those minutes every single night, and that's why having some of these veterans ends up being beneficial. I wonder how far the Nets will push that in terms of bringing in more youth and more flyer guys.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's like almost 20,000 minutes available in an NBA season, 19,680 to be exact. Like, and
19,600,
240 per game. So I just think sometimes there's an overestimation around like just how much is available, especially when you don't want to wear the tread down on guys needlessly. right? Like, so especially when you start taking a world where it's like, well, we just don't need we don't have Mikal Bridges who needs to play 37 minutes a game anymore, right? We don't have to
That's a
have
big
these guys.
difference, by the way, too. From last year to this year, his the Iron Man plays every single game and plays big minutes. That in and of itself is going to create different dynamics from minutes breakdowns because everybody else look across this roster. Even Cam Thomas had some injuries last year as well. Like it's not as easy as just pegging in 38 minutes a night every single night, 82 games. That's going to open up those things too. Yeah.
Pushing like 3,000 minutes. Like that's a lot, right? And
Yeah.
so and so when you figure like one of the guys we just talked about coming back for might not play that much at all. Like there's just a lot of already just out of the gate. There's a lot of minutes open, even if everything stood pat. I think people just kind of they see a guy that they don't want to see anymore, like Cam Johnson, let's say, or DFS, and they're like, he's blocking development. That's just not how it works. I think everyone can probably just take a breath around that.
It's interesting too, because you bring that up as well. Bogdanovic, Milton. I mean, Johnson and DFS are in a different category there. But you talk about development for the young players. Hey, guess what? You know what they do in between games? They practice. Like they get out there on the court and they work on sets. They try to work on things that they want to accomplish. Now, game reps are the most important reps you're going to get going against other teams that really want to clamp you down. But there's value also in having some guys around so that when you're working on the things you want to grow in, Cam Thomas going up against a bunch of, flyer guys in between games is different than maybe having Cam Johnson switch onto him defensively and try to get in front of him, make a problem. Or Dorian Finney-Smith saying, okay, I'm going to try to close out Jalen Wilson here when he's trying to get himself open on the perimeter for a shot, right? Like, I think that type of in-season value is the least sexiest thing to bring up around these guys because there's a good chance they're not going to be here. But there is some value in how you're getting reps and how you're working on things, especially when you're talking about going to the year. Well, again, wins and losses aren't going to matter here. The Brooklyn Nets are already thinking about next season and next year's draft class and what it means for them. So if you're only focused on development, there is a justified sacrifice of keeping some guys around to make sure that your locker room isn't filled with maybe a bunch of 24-year-olds who could go astray in terms of a long 82 game season that does not have a lot of, good vibes and winning necessarily attached to it.
Totally. And we've seen this play out. I'm telling you, we've seen this play out with other teams, like where it's just like, you don't know if you're coming or going. Like Portland was like this, has been like this a little bit after last year's season losing Dame, and also just like Dame was hurt a lot during that time. You just had a bunch of young guys just kind of running around. Houston, like we said before, they got Ime, was kind of just a running around territory. We've seen it kind of play out sort of poorly around if you just have a bunch of young dudes just kind of sprinting up and down the court. It's hard to sort of maintain a lot of semblance of order, I would say.
You lose a lot of possessions. You lose a lot of possessions to like, hey, me time, and it's not a knock. It's just for everybody, right? Like, hey, I'm going to go off for this possession. And that happens a handful of times a game. It adds up.
And not to mention, you have a guy in Simmons who's like, one of the biggest injury risk guys out there. So like, that's already, you're not banking him for 60 games, I don't think.
Yeah.
And like Cam Johnson dealt with injuries, DFS, like it's whatever. This is all to say there's plenty of minutes available, even if these guys stick on the team. With Bogey, like we'll see. Like I'd still like to hear some definitive news. With Milton, they still do need guard play. Like I know they signed Keon Johnson. I mean, Schroeder could be a guy. I mean, he could ball out here in the Olympics too, and maybe his market goes up a little bit. Like I'm not really sure, like sort of where he's going to land. Because he's actually always just had really, really good Germany minutes too, just the way they sort of run their system. And so I think there's just a world where this opens up sort of naturally anyway. We'll see with Shake Milton. I think he's probably going to play some just because they're going to need, now that Gilliard doesn't break out of summer league with the team because he's going to go overseas. I kind of saw that coming. There are backup point guard minutes to be available. I'm not sure Keon Johnson's like strictly a point guard here. If you're like fighting for backup point guard minutes, if you assume that Simmons can't really be trusted for the whole season, I think there's just like opportunity here for some of these other guys. It will be I will say this. Let's assume there's no trades. It will be fascinating to see how the preseason goes because right now we're taking just strict guesses at sort of what the rotation is going to be. And I've seen different people guess different things. Like I've seen people say, I guarantee Ben Simmons starts to start the year.
And you and I have debated that or whatever. Yeah.
I'm like, guarantee, man. I wouldn't guarantee that at all. I don't think so. We already disagree sort of on high level with some other Nets people that are pretty dialed in around like sort of even how if it stays true to right now, how the beginning of the season even opens up. I'm fascinated, even in a tanking season, to see sort of how they view this team and how they view certain guys.
Yep.
And so I'm just kind of like waiting to hear cool stuff, because right now, I'll say this right now, everyone's just guessing at this. Like, we're
Yeah,
all
yeah.
just guessing. Like, there's no one that really knows. We're all just sort of guessing how the rotations start and play out, and like sort of how the team really attacks this. And I think that's kind of, it's very cool for a team that where we're not going to really sweat the wins and losses. I think there's still like a lot of really interesting things to sort of dissect about how they view themselves in the short term.
Yeah, and you mentioned it there along the way with all the injuries to certain players like Cameron Johnson and otherwise. I mean, we'll do it coming up, like a rough like just a minute's idea of what it looks like with this current team. And when you add in Bogdanovic and Milton, you're now up to 5 veteran names on this roster, still a part of the team that may not be a part of the team. Or if they start the year with the team, they may not have as big a role with the team, right? So there's still, that's a third of the roster that could still see a significant shakeup here. And when you think about the Olympics and a guy like Schroeder, hey, that may open up new opportunities for the front office to explore. But it does make for an interesting what we got another solid 2 months before we get into the beginning of October and preseason basketball. Maybe training camp tells us something, but I think you're right. It's a lot of conjecture until we get some concrete eyes on what they're looking to do, because this is, again, the first time in a long time that the Nets are in a full traditional tanking rebuild. And that does apply differently to your expectations around how they have treated coaching and players and minutes and season over season versus what they're going to do this year. It's new territory for everybody.
Yeah, right. You can't one-to-one, and we'll get out of here. You can't one-to-one say, hey, this is what happened before, this is what's going to happen now. It's all new.
Yep.
Sean Marks. It's like Sean Marks, and that's it. Like, that's everyone else is pretty much different. Sean Marks, Cam Thomas, Nick Claxton, and it's all different.
And I
like
think Wilford Brimley like went into a cocoon. Now he's come out. We don't know, because he's becoming a new man. He could be anything in there.
God, he looked ancient. He was like my age when he used to start in Cocoon or something like that.
I know.
Like,
yeah.
It's like when you look back at this thing, it's like Wilford Brimley's living in the retirement home. And how old is he? He was like 47, like something like that. He just looked like he looked ancient. It's not that, but it's like really close. It's really close now. I mean, you got like, people running for office are going to feel like they're pushing 90. And like these guys were in the retirement home by the time they were 48 or whatever. What a life.
The Crypt Keepers. Got the Crypt
good old
Keepers out
days.
there on the campaign trail.
When people say the good old days, that's what they're talking about. Retire at 48, just move to Florida and just be done with it, man. It's all
When
good.
people talk about the good old days, they were talking about Wilford Brimley. I mean, that's, listen, there's something to be said there.
How could you not be one of the all-time greats? Find a quote from him before we get out of here. Okay, we're going to get out of here. Make sure that you subscribe to Locked On. I'm going to give Adam extra time here. Subscribe to Locked On Nets over on YouTube. Leave a comment. Like I said, we started this show talking about a comment that got left on YouTube because we're like, hey, let's talk about this. This is like we pushed another show idea back because we were like, hey, this is a cool thing to talk about now. We read every comment. Leave the comments. So make sure you're over on YouTube and subscribe.
I didn't get into acting school, but I've been observing my fellow man for 66 years now. And I would think that that's the best school that there is. Why, that was Herbert Humphrey. No, it's Wilford Brimley.
Oh, man. Yeah, I was just making sure to get this right. R.I.P. One of the all-time great.
You got to check because you don't know. You didn't. It was only 17 when he started Cocoon. That was the weird part.
It was pretty recently, too, 2020. All right, R.I.P. One of the all-time great poets. We're back in tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.
Basketball. Cocoon. Basketball.